When I came home from a 5-day trip, I knew something was wrong before I even turned off the engine. The house looked exactly the same, but the feeling was different. If you've ever walked into a place that should have welcomed you and instead made your stomach tighten with dread, then you'll understand what happened to me that afternoon. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 69 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that day, I believed I still had a place in my own family. The drive home from Branson, Missouri, had taken a little over 7 hours. My shoulders ached from sitting behind the wheel, and all I wanted was a hot shower, a cup of tea, and my own bed. The late afternoon sun hung low over the neighborhood as I turned onto Maple Ridge Lane. Everything looked familiar. The Johnsons' flag still waved from their porch. Mr. Calloway was trimming the hedges across the street. A pair of kids rode bicycles down the sidewalk. Ordinary. Peaceful. Safe. I remember smiling as I pulled closer to my driveway. Then the smile faded. My garage door was open. That wasn't unusual by itself. Ethan sometimes forgot to close it when he got home from work. Since my son, his wife Vanessa, and their 2 children had moved in after Ethan lost his previous job, small things around the house had changed. But as I slowed the car, another detail caught my attention. There was a silver SUV parked in my usual spot. Vanessa's vehicle. Again, not strange. Yet something about the way it sat there made me feel like a visitor approaching someone else's property. I told myself I was being silly. 7 hours on the road could make anyone tired. I pulled to the curb and switched off the engine. The neighborhood suddenly felt too quiet. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. The front curtains were different. White instead of beige. I frowned. I didn't remember buying white curtains. Then I noticed flower pots beside the front steps. New flower pots. Bright blue ceramic ones. Vanessa had talked about getting those months ago. She said they would make the house look more modern. I remembered telling her we could discuss it later. Apparently later had arrived while I was gone. I stepped out of the car and stretched my back. A warm breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed. Everything should have felt comforting. Instead, I felt like an outsider studying someone else's life. I walked toward the house, rolling my suitcase behind me. Halfway up the driveway I stopped. The front door looked different. First I couldn't understand why. Then I realized the brass handle was gone. In its place was a newer black lock set. My heart skipped. I stared at it. Maybe Ethan had replaced a broken lock. Maybe he had told me and I had forgotten. There had to be an explanation. I kept walking. One step. Then another. As I reached the edge of the lawn, something caught my eye near the large oak tree my husband and I had planted 32 years earlier. A cardboard box sat in the grass. Just one box. It looked oddly out of place beneath the tree. I frowned and took another step. Then I saw a second box. And a third. My pulse quickened. I turned my head slowly toward the side yard. More boxes. Stacked in neat rows. Brown cardboard. Plastic storage bins. A folded chair. My breath caught in my throat. Suddenly the exhaustion from the drive disappeared. I wasn't tired anymore. I wasn't thinking about tea or dinner or my own bed. I was staring at the lawn, trying to understand why pieces of my life seemed to be scattered across the grass. Then I saw something that made my knees feel weak. Sitting alone beside the driveway was my blue suitcase. The same suitcase I had taken on the trip. Attached to the handle was a sheet of white paper, fluttering gently in the wind. My fingers trembled as I reached for the paper attached to the suitcase handle. It was a plain sheet torn from a notebook, folded once and secured with clear tape. For a moment I simply stared at it. The late afternoon breeze lifted one corner, making it flutter against the blue fabric. I already had a terrible feeling about what it would say. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the words written across the page. Sorry, Mom. You do not belong here now. Ethan. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Each reading felt colder than the last. My son had signed his name at the bottom. Not typed. Not printed. Written in the same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards, school permission slips, and thank you notes over 4 decades. I lowered the paper slowly and looked toward the house. The front windows reflected the golden sunlight. The place looked peaceful. Ordinary. As if nothing had happened. As if someone's entire life was not sitting in cardboard boxes beneath an oak tree. I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, a mistake, a cruel joke. Ethan would never do this. That was what I told myself. Ethan was the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The teenager who hugged me after his father passed away and promised we would always take care of each other. The man who cried when I let him move back into the house after losing his job. That Ethan would never leave my belongings on the lawn. Yet the note remained in my hand. I took a slow breath and walked toward the front door. My footsteps felt strangely loud. The new lock looked even more unfamiliar up close. I reached for the handle and turned it. Locked. I tried again. Nothing. My key did not fit. I stared at the key for several seconds before trying a second time. Then a third. The result never changed. Someone had replaced the locks while I was away. A sharp ache settled in my chest. Not panic. Not anger. Something quieter. Something heavier. I stepped back from the porch and looked through the front window. The living room furniture had been rearranged. My favorite reading chair was gone. In its place stood a decorative cabinet I had never seen before. New curtains framed the windows. New throw pillows sat on the sofa. Small details. But together they felt like evidence. Evidence that someone had been erasing me one piece at a time. Then movement caught my eye. A figure crossed the hallway. Vanessa. She was carrying a laundry basket. She stopped suddenly when she saw me standing outside. For one brief second our eyes met through the glass. I expected surprise. Embarrassment. Maybe even guilt. Instead, her expression hardened. She turned away and disappeared into the house without opening the door. Without waving. Without saying a word. I stood there for several moments. Waiting. Surely Ethan would come out. Surely someone would explain. A minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. No one appeared. The silence was worse than any argument could have been. Across the street, Mr. Calloway had stopped trimming his hedges. He was watching me now. So was Mrs. Johnson from her porch. I realized the neighbors could see everything. They could see the boxes, the bins, the suitcase, the woman standing outside her own house like a stranger. Heat rose into my cheeks. Not because of the attention, because of the humiliation. I bent down and opened the nearest box. Family photographs. Framed pictures of birthdays, graduations, anniversaries. Another box held books from my bedroom shelf. Another contained winter sweaters neatly folded as though someone had packed them with care. That almost made it worse. This had not happened during an emotional argument. It had been planned, organized, deliberate. Whoever packed these boxes had taken their time. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, a long shadow stretched across the lawn. I looked at the rows of boxes again. There were more than I had first realized. Dozens of them. An entire life reduced to cardboard and tape. Then I noticed something tucked between 2 storage bins near the edge of the yard. A large manila envelope. My name was written across the front in black marker. And suddenly I knew the note was only the beginning. For several seconds I simply stared at the manila envelope. The sunlight had begun to fade, turning the edges of the yard gold and amber, but that envelope seemed brighter than everything around it. My name was written across the front in thick black marker. Margaret Collins. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just my name. The distance in those 2 words unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I walked toward it slowly, weaving between boxes filled with pieces of my life. Family photo albums. Christmas decorations. The quilt my grandmother had sewn in 1958. A collection of cookbooks stained with years of holiday dinners. Every step felt heavier than the one before. When I reached the envelope, I bent down and picked it up. It was thicker than I expected. Several sheets of paper were inside. My hands felt cold despite the warm evening air. I opened the flap carefully and pulled out the contents. The first page was a typed letter. At the top was Ethan's name. I immediately recognized the format. It looked like something Vanessa would have prepared. Professional. Formal. Distant. The kind of letter people use when they want emotions removed from a decision that should never have been made in the first place. I began reading. The words blurred at first. I had to start over. According to the letter, new living arrangements had been made. According to the letter, the house was now intended for Ethan, Vanessa, and the children. According to the letter, My continued presence would create unnecessary tension within the household. I stopped reading and lowered the page. Tension. That was the word they chose. Not family. Not love. Not gratitude. Tension. 32 years in that home had been reduced to a problem they wanted removed. I looked toward the front window again. A light came on inside the kitchen. For a brief moment, I saw my grandson Tyler walk past the doorway carrying a glass of milk. He looked happy, relaxed, completely unaware that his grandmother was standing outside among cardboard boxes. My throat tightened. Not because I blamed him. He was only 11 years old. But because I suddenly understood how quickly a person could disappear from a family's daily life. One decision. One conversation behind closed doors. One locked door. That was all it took. I continued reading. Attached to the letter were copies of several documents. Utility account changes. Mailing address updates. Household expense records. The paperwork suggested planning. Weeks of planning. Maybe months. None of this had happened while I was away for 5 days. The trip had simply given them the opportunity to finish something they had already started. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 months earlier, Vanessa had asked where I kept certain financial records. She claimed she was organizing household files. At the time I thought nothing of it. Another memory followed. Ethan insisting that I take a vacation because I had not traveled since my husband passed away. Then another. Vanessa encouraging me to stay an extra day when I called to say I might come home early. One by one, moments I had ignored began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. Across the street, Mr. Calloway finally crossed the road and approached me. He removed his gardening gloves as he walked. His expression was careful, almost hesitant. That alone told me he knew more than he wanted to say. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the boxes scattered across the lawn. Then he looked at me. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I was wondering when you were coming back. There is something you need to know." The look in his eyes told me whatever came next would be far worse than the note, the locked door, or the letter in my hands. Mr. Calloway glanced toward the house before speaking again. The hesitation in his voice unsettled me. We had been neighbors for more than 20 years. He was not a man who enjoyed gossip, and he certainly was not someone who interfered in other people's family matters. If he had crossed the street to speak to me, then whatever he knew had been weighing on him for a while. "Margaret," he said quietly, "they told everyone you were moving." I stared at him. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. "Moving?" I repeated. He nodded. "Vanessa said you had decided to start a new chapter. She told us you wanted something smaller. Said you were excited about it." I looked back at the boxes scattered across the lawn. Excited. The word almost made me laugh. There was nothing exciting about standing outside your own home with nowhere to go. "When did they tell people this?" I asked. Mr. Calloway shifted uncomfortably. "A while ago. Maybe 6 or 7 weeks." My stomach tightened. 6 or 7 weeks. Long before my trip. Long before the note. Long before I found myself locked out. The plan had been unfolding right in front of me, while I was still setting places for family dinners and believing everything was normal. "There is more," he said. His eyes dropped briefly to the envelope in my hand. "A moving company came by twice while you were gone. They loaded things into storage containers. Vanessa supervised everything." I closed my eyes for a second. Images flashed through my mind. Vanessa encouraging me to visit my old friend in Missouri. Ethan insisting I deserved a break. Their unusual enthusiasm when I extended the trip by an extra day. At the time it had felt thoughtful. Now it felt calculated. Did Ethan help? I asked. The question came out softer than I intended. Mr. Calloway took a long breath before answering. "Yes." That single word hurt more than everything else combined. Not because I believed Vanessa was innocent. I never did. But part of me had still hoped my son had been pressured into something he did not fully understand. Hearing that simple answer forced me to confront a reality I had been avoiding. Ethan knew. Ethan participated. Ethan watched it happen. The evening air had grown cooler. Streetlights began flickering on one by one throughout the neighborhood. Behind the front window I saw movement again. Tyler appeared briefly in the living room before disappearing down the hallway. A few seconds later, my granddaughter Emma crossed the room carrying a stuffed animal. Life inside the house continued as if nothing unusual had happened. As if their grandmother was not standing outside among taped boxes and discarded memories. "I am sorry, Margaret," Mr. Calloway said. "Several of us thought it seemed strange. But they made it sound like this was your decision." I nodded slowly. I was not angry with him. If someone told me a neighbor had chosen to move, I would probably believe it too. That was the brilliance of the lie. It sounded reasonable, respectable, clean. Nobody questioned it. Nobody imagined the truth. I looked down at the envelope again. Hidden beneath the paperwork was a smaller folded sheet. I had not noticed it before. Carefully, I pulled it free. Unlike the typed documents, this page was handwritten. The handwriting was not Ethan's. It belonged to Vanessa. I recognized the neat slanted letters immediately. At the top of the page was a short sentence. Just 9 words. 9 words that suddenly explained everything. I read them once, then again, and as their meaning settled over me, I realized this was never about space, tension, or new beginnings. Vanessa had wanted something very specific from the start, and according to the note in my hands, she believed she had finally gotten it. The sentence at the top of the page read, "A house cannot have 2 queens." I stared at the words for a long time. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant. Vanessa had taken the time to write them neatly, as if that somehow made them less cruel. Beneath the sentence was a short note. She explained that every family eventually had to move forward. She wrote that Ethan needed to become the true head of the household. She wrote that the children needed stability, and that too many opinions under one roof created confusion. The entire message was wrapped in polite language, but the meaning was unmistakable. She did not see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Mr. Calloway watched me with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. I looked at the house again. Through the front window I could see the glow of the dining room light. That room had once been the center of every holiday gathering. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, birthday cakes covered in candles. My husband, Robert, had built the dining table with his own hands shortly after we bought the house. Ethan had learned to do homework at that table. He had opened college acceptance letters there. He had introduced Vanessa to us there. Now I was standing outside while strangers to my heart sat inside my memories. "I will be fine," I said quietly. The words surprised even me, because somehow they were true. Hurt and confusion still sat heavily in my chest, but another feeling had begun to take shape beneath them. Clarity. For the first time that day I stopped asking why. The answer no longer mattered. The real question was what came next. Mr. Calloway offered to help me move the boxes somewhere safe. Together we carried several of them into his garage before darkness settled completely over the neighborhood. As we worked, he mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "There were real estate people here last week," he said. I stopped lifting a storage bin. "Real estate people?" He nodded. "A couple of them walked through the house with clipboards. I assumed your family was refinancing or something." My pulse quickened. Vanessa's note suddenly felt different. More urgent. More revealing. If agents had already toured the property, then this was not simply about pushing me aside. There was a larger plan. After another hour, most of the important boxes were protected inside his garage. The rest could wait until morning. I thanked him and returned to my car. The sky above Maple Ridge Lane had turned deep blue. Porch lights glowed softly up and down the street. Families were settling in for the evening. I sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. My phone rested on the passenger seat. For several minutes I stared at it. Ethan had not called. Not once. No message. No explanation. No apology. Nothing. Eventually I opened my contacts and scrolled down to a name I had not called in nearly a year. Daniel Harper. My husband's attorney. After Robert passed away, Daniel had helped me organize estate documents and legal records. He was honest, thorough, and impossible to intimidate. At the time, I had hoped I would never need his services again. My finger hovered over the number. Then I pressed call. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Margaret," he said, sounding surprised. "It has been a while. Is everything okay?" I looked through the windshield toward the dark outline of my house. Then I glanced at the envelope resting beside me. "No, Daniel," I said calmly. "I think something is very wrong. And I need to know exactly what has been happening while I was away." There was a brief silence on the line. Then his voice became serious. "Tell me everything." Daniel listened without interrupting as I explained everything. The note, the boxes, the locked door, the documents inside the envelope. Every so often I could hear him typing. When I finally finished, there was silence on the line for several seconds. "Margaret," he said carefully, "where are you right now?" "In my car." "Good. Stay there for the moment. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. And whatever you do, keep every piece of paper they gave you." Something in his tone made me sit up straighter. "Why?" I asked. Another pause. "Because some of what you described does not make sense." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if the property records are what I remember them to be, your son cannot simply remove you from the house." I stared through the windshield. Across the street, porch lights glowed against the darkness. The neighborhood looked peaceful, normal. Yet my heart was suddenly beating much faster. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I am sure enough that I want to verify everything first thing tomorrow morning." For the first time since arriving home, a small crack appeared in the wall of despair that had surrounded me all day. Not hope, not yet, but uncertainty. And uncertainty was better than defeat. Daniel asked me several questions about recent conversations with Ethan and Vanessa. As I answered, more details surfaced. Vanessa asking unusual questions about insurance documents. Ethan insisting on helping organize financial records. Requests to locate old files after Robert's death. At the time, every conversation had seemed harmless. Looking back, they felt different. Deliberate. Focused. Like pieces of a larger plan. Did either of them ever ask about the trust? Daniel asked suddenly. I froze. The trust. I had not thought about it in months. Robert and I established it years earlier as part of our estate planning. Vanessa asked about it once, I said slowly. She said she was trying to understand family finances. Daniel made a sound that was almost a sigh. I see. Daniel, what are you not telling me? Another brief silence. I am telling you only what I know. The rest needs verification. But I think there is information your son and daughter-in-law may not fully understand. Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. Information they did not understand. Around 9 o'clock, I checked into a small motel 2 miles away. It was not glamorous. The carpet was worn and the furniture was dated. But the room was clean. More importantly, it had a lock that belonged to me. I placed the envelope on the small desk beside the window and sat on the edge of the bed. Exhaustion settled over me all at once. Yet sleep felt impossible. Instead, I opened the envelope again and reviewed every document one by one. Halfway through the stack, something unusual caught my attention. A printed property summary. At first glance it looked ordinary. Then I noticed the date. The document had been printed less than 2 weeks earlier. Someone had recently accessed information about the house. More importantly, a highlighted section contained a name that immediately made my pulse quicken. Robert Collins. Not Ethan. Not Vanessa. My late husband's name still appeared in a place I did not expect. I leaned closer and read the paragraph again. Then a third time. The meaning slowly settled over me. If I was interpreting it correctly, Ethan and Vanessa were making decisions based on an assumption. And assumptions have a dangerous habit of collapsing when they meet the truth. I reached for my phone and took a picture of the page. Then I placed the document carefully back into the envelope. Tomorrow morning, Daniel would examine everything. And for the first time since finding my life packed into cardboard boxes, I had the distinct feeling that the story was far from over. The next morning, I arrived at Daniel Harper's office carrying the envelope as if it contained something fragile. In a way it did. It contained the remains of everything I thought I knew about my family. Daniel greeted me at the door and led me into a conference room lined with shelves of legal books. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a polished oak table. The setting felt calm, almost comforting. I needed that. Because the moment I sat down and handed him the documents, the reality of the previous day came rushing back. Daniel spent nearly an hour reviewing every page. He read carefully, making notes in the margins and occasionally asking questions. I answered as best I could. When he finally leaned back in his chair, his expression had changed. He no longer looked concerned. He looked focused. "Margaret," he said, folding his hands together, "I think your son and daughter-in-law made a very serious mistake." My heart skipped. What kind of mistake? Daniel turned one of the documents toward me and pointed to a section near the bottom. "They appear to believe they have authority they do not actually possess." I stared at the page. Legal language had never been my strength. Daniel noticed my confusion and explained patiently. Years earlier, shortly after Robert retired, we had restructured several family assets. At the time, it seemed like a routine estate planning decision. Robert handled most of the details while I attended meetings and signed paperwork when necessary. I remembered the process vaguely. What I did not remember was one specific provision buried inside those documents. Daniel tapped the page again. "The property is protected by conditions that remain active today." A strange feeling spread through me. Protected from what? From exactly this sort of situation. He opened another file from his cabinet and placed it beside the documents from the envelope. The signatures matched. The dates matched. More importantly, the language matched. The house was not simply a piece of property that could be transferred through assumptions and family pressure. There were safeguards. Legal safeguards. Robert had anticipated problems long before any of them existed. I looked down at the paperwork and suddenly remembered a conversation from years ago. We had been sitting on the back porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the yard. Robert had smiled and said, "If anything ever happens to me, I want you protected." At the time, I thought he was talking about insurance. Maybe savings. I never imagined he meant this. Daniel continued reviewing records on his computer. A few minutes later, he found something else. A recent inquiry connected to the property. Someone had been exploring options for a future sale. The request had not been completed, but it existed. Vanessa's note. The real estate agents. The moving company. Suddenly the pieces aligned. They had not simply wanted me out of the house. They wanted control of what came after. Daniel printed several pages and placed them neatly into a folder. "For now," he said, "do not contact them. Do not argue. Do not announce what we discovered." I raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "Because people reveal more when they think they have already won." Those words stayed with me as I left the office. Outside, the morning air felt crisp and clean. For the first time in days, I stood a little straighter. I was still hurt, still disappointed, still grieving a version of my family that no longer existed. But beneath all of that, something stronger had begun to emerge. Confidence. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. The message was from Ethan. His first message since I found my belongings on the lawn. And what he wrote made it immediately clear that neither he nor Vanessa had any idea what Daniel and I had just uncovered. I stood beside my car in the parking lot and opened Ethan's message. It was surprisingly short. "Mom, we should talk. Vanessa and I think it would be best if we meet tomorrow. There are still a few documents that need your signature." I read it twice. Not a single word about the note. Not a single apology. No explanation for the boxes. No acknowledgement that I had been locked out of my own home. Just documents. Just signatures. The message told me everything I needed to know. They believed their plan was working. They believed I was confused, isolated, and ready to accept whatever version of events they presented. Most importantly, they believed I had no idea what was actually happening. I slipped the phone back into my purse and drove to the motel. That evening, I sat by the window and watched traffic move along the highway while reviewing everything Daniel had given me. The folder contained copies of records, notes, and several pages explaining the protections Robert had established years ago. The more I read, the more one fact became clear. My husband had been far more careful than I ever realized. He had anticipated circumstances that I considered impossible. Back then, I used to tease him about his planning. Robert always laughed and said hope was important, but preparation was wiser. Sitting alone in that motel room, I finally understood what he meant. The next morning, another message arrived from Ethan. He suggested meeting at a coffee shop near the shopping center at noon. I agreed. Nothing more. Nothing less. When I arrived the following day, Ethan and Vanessa were already seated at a corner table. Vanessa wore a pleasant smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ethan looked tired. Older somehow. As I approached, both of them stood. Vanessa immediately stepped forward and offered a quick hug. I politely declined. Her smile flickered for a fraction of a second before returning. We sat down. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. The weather. The children. School activities. It felt strangely rehearsed. Eventually Vanessa placed a small stack of papers on the table. There it was. The real reason for the meeting. We just need to finalize a few things, she said cheerfully. Nothing complicated. I glanced at the documents but did not touch them. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, we know this transition has been difficult. Transition. Another carefully chosen word. Not betrayal. Not eviction. Transition. I watched him quietly. He avoided eye contact. Vanessa continued speaking. She explained how stressful the situation had been for everyone. She described the future they were building. She talked about stability for the children. Every sentence centered on what they wanted. Not once did she ask where I had slept. Not once did she ask how I was doing. When she finally finished, silence settled over the table. Then Ethan pushed the documents slightly closer. If you sign these, everything can move forward. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. For a moment I saw the little boy he used to be. Then the image disappeared. In its place sat a grown man who had convinced himself that convenience was the same thing as fairness. I folded my hands calmly. I would like my attorney to review these first, I said. Vanessa's smile vanished completely. Ethan blinked. Attorney, he asked. The single word carried more surprise than it should have. I nodded. Yes, my attorney. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Vanessa forced a laugh. That seems unnecessary. I met her gaze. I disagree. For the first time since the conversation began, uncertainty appeared on her face. Small, brief, but unmistakable. And in that moment, I realized the balance of power had started to shift. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Vanessa gathered the papers with movements that were a little less confident than before. Ethan barely spoke as we stood to leave. For the first time since I returned home, neither of them seemed certain about what would happen next. That uncertainty grew over the following week. Daniel moved quickly. He reviewed every document connected to the property, the trust, and Robert's estate. Each day brought another piece of information. Some of it surprised me. Some of it broke my heart. But none of it changed the central fact. The house was protected in ways Ethan and Vanessa had never bothered to understand. One afternoon Daniel called and asked me to come to his office. When I arrived, several folders were spread across the conference table. He pointed to a series of records and explained everything carefully. The protections Robert established years ago remained fully enforceable. Certain decisions required conditions that had never been met. Certain actions required approvals that had never been obtained. Most importantly, the authority Ethan and Vanessa believed they possessed simply did not exist. They had built an entire plan on assumptions. Daniel smiled faintly. The law is not impressed by assumptions. 2 days later, a formal meeting was scheduled. Ethan attended. Vanessa attended. Daniel sat beside me. The atmosphere felt very different from the coffee shop. There were no cheerful smiles. No casual conversation. Only documents, facts, and questions. At first Vanessa tried to maintain the same confident tone she always used. She spoke about family needs, future plans, sacrifices, stability. Daniel listened politely. Then he began presenting records. One by one the assumptions collapsed. Every time he placed another document on the table, Vanessa became quieter. Ethan's expression changed as well. Confusion appeared first, then disbelief, then embarrassment. At one point he looked directly at me. Mom, I did not know any of this. The words hung in the air. For years I would have rushed to comfort him. I would have searched for excuses. This time I simply listened. Because whether he understood the details or not, He had still watched my belongings being carried onto the lawn. He had still signed the note. He had still chosen silence. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was unavoidable. The plan could not continue. The decisions they had made would have to be reversed. Several actions would need immediate correction. No one raised their voice. No dramatic confrontation occurred. The truth did not need help. It was powerful enough on its own. As we left the building, Vanessa walked ahead without saying a word. Ethan remained behind. For a moment, it was just the two of us standing near the parking lot. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. Defeated. "I am sorry," he said quietly. I studied his face. Part of me wanted to believe everything could return to the way it was before. But trust is not a light switch. It does not turn back on the moment someone apologizes. "I know," I replied. Then I got into my car and drove away. Several weeks later, my belongings were back where they belonged. The house felt familiar again. The oak tree still stood in the yard. The porch looked the same. The rooms carried the same memories. Yet I had changed. I no longer confused sacrifice with security. I no longer assumed love would automatically protect someone from betrayal. One evening I sat on the back porch where Robert and I once watched summer storms roll across the horizon. The sky glowed orange as the sun disappeared behind the trees. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. I thought about the note, the boxes, the locked door. Then I thought about something Robert used to say. A home is not defined by the people who try to take it from you. It is defined by the courage to remain standing when they do. And as I sat there watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized they had tried to remove me from the house. What they never understood was that I had always been part of its foundation.